Howdy, welcome to another episode of Canon Calls. I am your host, Jake McAtee, and this week I had the pleasure of speaking with one of my favorite living poets, A.M. Juster. Now, if you heard that name and that sounds like a very unique name, that is a pseudonym for a man by the name of Michael James Astrew, who's an American lawyer, and under the pen name of A.M. Juster, he is a poet and a critic. He served as commissioner of the Social Security Administration from 2007 to 2013. He was also the poetry editor of First Things and is now poetry editor of Plow Quarterly. We talk about what it was like to be a poet living in all kinds of political turmoil, his time in the Bush administration. It's really a very interesting interview. And without further ado, meet A.M. Juster. Awesome. Welcome to another episode of Canon Calls. This week, I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with A.M. Juster, the poet of a brand new book coming out September 29th, which by the time this will be live, it'll be past that date. So go and get Wonder and Wrath from Paul Dry Books. Mr. Juster, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you. No, I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. So do you mind telling us about Wonder and Wrath? You've got it broken up into 3 parts. Can you sort of introduce us to the book you wrote?
Sure. So it's not a book that started as a concept. It's a book that evolved over a very long period of time. This is my 10th book, but it's only my 2nd book of serious original poetry. I've done a lot of translation, and I've done 2 humorous books. And it evolved a bit over time. I really started thinking about it as a book probably in the last 3-4 years. And after I'd worked on it a little while, I realized it kind of broke into 3 categories. There's translations at the end, and a lot of those translations that I picked tie in with some of my own poems that, where you spend a lot of time translating. It often gives you ideas and thoughts of some of your own poems. And then I've got a section of more outward poems where I'm observing and looking at the world. And then I've got a second section that's much more inward focused. A little bit of a turn for me. There's a little bit more, I don't want to say confessional, but work a little bit more in that vein in this book than there was in the previous book. So those are the 3 sections it breaks into.
Yeah, so I'm curious. You mentioned it being a little different from the rest. How could you talk a little bit more about that? How would you see Wonder and Wrath in relation to the books of poetry you've written before?
It's a couple things. I think in comparison to The Secret Language of Women, which won the Richard Wilbur Award in 2002, as a still fairly new formal poet, I was working much more in received forms and probably a little anxious about getting outside that for fear that people would think I didn't know how to do it. And I think that this book is more varied and a little bit more innovative in terms of form, altering the rules to try to say something a little bit different. I work a little bit in Anglo-Saxon alliterative meter, in other words, the meter of Beowulf, which came, again, from translating. One of the things I put aside for the moment is I'm working on a collection of poems related to the Phoenix Smith. And I've translated, for the first time from Old English, the Old English Phoenix, which is quite long. I think it's about 650 lines. And I just really came to love the rhythms and the sounds of it, which wasn't surprising because I've done a little bit of translating from Middle Welsh, which also has, that same sort of banging rhythms and rich alliteration and just a texture that's a lot different from a lot of contemporary poetry. So it's a little bit more all over the map in terms of form, which I like. It's probably got a few more personal poems, and it has more poems touching on faith than the first book, and maybe about half a dozen poems touching more directly on faith.
What was the book you mentioned won the Richard Wilbur Poetry Award?
It's called The Secret Language of Women, and it's named after, I think I've actually probably a quarter of the sales were people that got it confused with some self-help book or something like that. But
were they returned though? I mean,
yeah, I don't know. I hope they kept them. But it comes from a long poem, the only long poem I've written, which is almost 400 lines.
Goodness.
I read a newspaper article that got me researching because I was fascinated by this, that there was an actual written language variant of Chinese that had been around for about 1,000 years that was about to die out, and the communist government had been trying to weed it out. And then just as it was about to die out, they changed their mind. I guess, they decided it had tourist value and that kind of thing, and they were trying to, at the last minute, sort of rescue it. And one of the things I discovered is that the mythology about it was that it started as a poem of a courtesan, one of the nobles, the emperor. And I thought that was interesting. But it became a language exclusively of very poor women of the countryside. And so I started thinking about what happened here. How did it get, from the castle to the countryside? And so basically, I just tried to put together sort of a plausible story, respectful of everything that we do know about the language. It's called Nushu, N-U-S-H-U, in case anybody wants to check it out on the internet. It's called the secret language of women, basically because it was a secret language of women. They didn't share it with men. It wasn't, particularly well known for a long time that, it even existed, but it did apparently exist for a very, very long time. And I just was fascinated by the story. And since there were details to the story I couldn't find, I just decided finally to create my own and try to fill in the gaps.
I feel like maybe just hearing the title alone, there's a large portion of my male audience that was like, maybe the secret's in there. I need to get the book.
Yeah, no, nothing that's going to get a single male more interested necessarily.
Oh man!
But,
well, that was your pitch. That was the pitch I was going to give. But now, maybe those sales are good.
Yeah, I'm not very good. I'm not very good at this whole marketing thing.
Yeah. We'll edit that part out. Now, you've brought up translation several times. Can you talk about that? I feel like you have the amount of languages I think exceeded my at least one hand. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I started translation really as an exercise. But almost 30 years ago, I decided to go back to writing poetry. And when I had taken it seriously in high school and college, I was writing, I think, very imitative free verse. And I got some discouragement from a prominent poet, and I was a little dissatisfied with my own work. So I stopped. I stopped for about a decade. And what got me going is I was working in Washington, and I read a review by the future chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, Dana Gioia, of what was then a new book, which was Philip Larkin's Collected. And I loved the review. It made me go out and buy the book. I loved the book. And then I said to myself, this is the poetry I really loved when I first started loving poetry. I wonder if I can teach myself to write like that. And of course, in those days, there was no internet. Shortly thereafter, there was a conference of formal poets, and there were more journals, and there was kind of a network, but there really wasn't much. So I was reading the texts that were available, and I was, working on writing prompts and that kind of thing. And I started working on translation really as an exercise. But then I started lining up what I was doing against, what the famous poets were doing. And I said to myself, well, I think I'm actually holding my own here. And so I started sending them out. And I actually, in the beginning, was much more successful sending out translations than my own poem.
Wow.
So, I first broke into the Formalist, which was a great journal for 25 years, which for me was, kind of the gold standard. I actually got in there first with a number of translations. I didn't get an original poem in there till 95. And then I broke it in a big way because I won the second Howard Nemeroff Sonnet Award with a poem called Moscow Zoo that Mona Van Dyne selected for the award. And then after that, I kind of became a regular. But it took me a little while, to hone the craft and be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and, that kind of thing. It took a while. And so I did it originally that way. And then I enjoyed doing it. It did open up journals to me that might not be otherwise open. And then at some point, I started shooting for the book length translations, and that's gone, extremely well for me. And for a couple of them, I've done scholarly commentaries too, because I really needed to do them in order to translate the work and really understand it well enough. Because I went through a period where I was working on more obscure texts that I thought deserved more attention. St. Oldham's riddles, which I love, and Maximianus's elegies, which I think is the most overlooked text of Roman literature. There really wasn't a serious translation in English, and there's only one commentary, and that's a little eccentric from 1900. So now there's an eccentric one from 2018. But I'm going back now to actually my very first effort where I failed. I did about 25 poems and kind of hit the wall and published those in a small volume, which is Petrarch's Canzoniere. And I went back with a vengeance late last year, and I'm talking to a major publisher, and I've got about 200 of the 366 poems done now. So I'm hoping,
wow.
My goal is to finish that by the end of next year. And if I can do that and do it, at a sufficient level of quality, I think it will garner a lot of attention, because there really hasn't been a translation of that incredibly important text that has been very satisfactory to most readers. So to get it accurate, get it to be good poetry, and get it into meter and rhyme, is a huge challenge.
Right. Right.
I spent 3.5 days on 2 lines the other day.
Unreal.
But one of the things about having to take early retirement is now I got to have a little bit more time on my hands than I have, historically.
So that kind of, you saying the amount of time it took you to do those lines, I'm curious, somebody who I hope we will get to talk more about later in the interview is Richard Wilbur, but he would talk about when folks would ask, how do you write poetry? He would just say, I'm the kind of person who can sit down for 8 hours and not get a lot done, but sit there and think hard and clearly, are you that kind of person? How is it that you go about writing your poems?
Well, yes and no. I've only really found out relatively recently, because, I've had a pretty busy professional life until 7 years ago. But yes, now I'm probably different in this sense, in that I loved Richard Wilbur. I got to know him just a little bit towards the end of his life. I think the last blurb he wrote was for the Oldham book, which kind of, the riddles kind of brought us together, because he's the only other person. He translated a couple.
I was going to say, well, when I got to that part of your book, I got so excited because I've only seen that name one other time, and that was in a Richard Wilbur book. Yeah.
And one of the things I'm hoping will come out soon, somehow, and it's on my wish list. I actually started to try to prod his publisher and then got distracted. But Richard also translated all the riddles of Symphosius. He published a number of them in his various selecteds and collecteds, but I know that he finished all of them. And
wow.
I would love to see them, out as a separate edition.
Right.
But I always imagine Richard, I think, was a more centered, peaceful, quiet person than I am. I think I share his capacity for work.
Okay.
So I'm putting many days, 8, 10, even 12 hours a day into the Petrarch project these days. But I can't sit still and look
at the line.
On and on. Yeah, I get twitchy. And so
that comes out in your work a little bit. I think I knew that about you without you saying that.
Yeah. And I have to get up and, I've got to take a break. I got to clear my head. So, I check my email, or I'll allow myself 15 minutes of online Scrabble. And actually what has been the best thing for me in many ways, despite all the aggravations that go with it, is we got another puppy a year and a half ago. And so puppies need to be walked.
Yeah.
And so the puppy deserves probably a thank you if this book ever comes out, because a lot of times when I'm stuck and I've got my rhyming dictionaries, and I've got my thesaurus, and I've got my various editions of the text, and I've got my Italian dictionary, and I've got all this stuff out on the table, and I've been looking at it and banging and nothing's happening. It's amazing. A lot of times you just go out, you clear your head. You're not really thinking about it hard, but you can't completely stop thinking about it.
Right.
Those are often the moments when the answer comes to you.
Right.
And you come back from the puppy walk and you say, yes, I think I've got it.
Okay, well, I know who the dedication is going to already. So there it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so just by way of note, I wanted to say that in your proposed cliches, which I enjoyed immensely, I thought maybe a great banner for 2020 was your ask not what your country can do for fear of the answer.
Yes.
Loved it.
Yes.
I love that.
And it rings in a little board because it rhymes, with the previous, couplet, which has cancer and something else in it. And yeah, and it's, playing on the famous JFK quote. And of course probably people will look at that and think that's a Trump related poem of the moment. And I probably shouldn't disabuse people of that. That's probably good marketing.
Sure.
But the truth is, it's a little bit older than that. And so it goes back to what I said before about translation. So my one appearance in Poetry magazine came with a translation that's in the book. And I believe the first literary translations into English of an East African language called Oromo. And it's a project that I started, I think, in 1995. And I kind of picked at it and kept changing it. So it's at the time I started, actually, I was at it so long that when I started it, Oromo was not a written language. It was only an oral language. So the raw material came from anthropologists who had collated over 4,000 proverbs, and they would give the literal translation and then they'd give a phonetic translation so you could get the general sense of the rhythm and the rhyme. Not all of them rhymed, but a lot of the proverbs rhymed. And so there were a lot to choose from. And some of them are terrible. As you would think you go, 4,000 proverbs, they're not all great. But there were some wonderful ones.
Maybe a solid 1,000, are probably not great.
Yeah. And so I picked it up, let it sit, kept changing, adding different. So I toyed with it for about 20 years before I sent it out. And at the last cleanup, I took the main book out of Widener Library at Harvard again. And then I checked the back of it. And so they've had the book for like 30 some odd years, and I'm still the only person who's ever taken it out.
Wow.
And so, you talk about working in something obscure, but I did love it. And it did get me thinking about proverbs. And Maximianus people have noted, has a very proverbial knack. He wrote in couplets, and a lot of, particularly the second lines of the couplets, have sort of a proverbial feel. And at some point, having just immersed myself in it, I started thinking that, it'd be fun to play around with that. And the idea of just sort of twisting familiar phrases so that it doesn't lead you where you think it's going to lead you, and makes you think a little differently about the original and that kind of stuff. So, that's what I was trying to do. But it is fairly typical of Wonder and Wrath in that, they're probably, I haven't counted it up, but there are probably about 10 original poems in that volume that wouldn't exist but for the fact that I spent time translating something that inspired it. Most of the translations that were the inspirations are in the book, although maybe not every single one. Okay. As
I considered sort of how to introduce your style to our listeners, I thought one great way was introducing your book, or talking about your book, The Billy Collins Experience. I've had sort of a through line on this podcast of thinking of ways, how do I give a love of poetry to someone else? Like, I've found that I'm profoundly bad at that. So I thought if I could have not only poets on, but people to introduce other poets, things of that nature. And I somehow, through the internet's, that world, I found Billy Collins' email. And I just sent him an email, and he was very kind enough to come on for a little bit of time. So basically, you being a formalist and a classicist versus him being, a very comic free verser. If you ever hear his poems live, it sounds like a comedy set of sorts. Could you break down that distinction for folks who maybe wouldn't know, those qualifiers wouldn't mean anything to them? What's the difference as sort of the premise of that book?
So Collins and I are different in a couple of ways. I think the main thing is the structure of the poems. So my poems almost always have a metrical structure. In other words, there's a set pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. They often, but not always, rhyme. And I've been doing other things. I've been working internal rhyme a little bit more in patterns into some of my more recent poems and that kind of thing. And that's basically stuff that Collins not only rejects, but mocks. And this is part of my unhappiness with Billy Collins. And he's, aside from pointed comments he's made about people like me, he did a very funny satire on people like me. He created a fake form called the paradel with sort of a ridiculous repeating pattern, and gave it sort of a vague medieval history and that kind of thing. And a number of people fell for it, including, most famously a friend of mine who's a very fine professor of English who didn't realize it was a joke from Billy Collins. So I think particularly when he was poet laureate, the fact that he was very harsh toward, I think, a very important school of poetry, it lowered my opinion of him. And I do like some of his early work, and I think it's very hard to write funny poetry, having tried to do it myself. And I think it's actually harder in free verse, because I think the rhythms of formal poetry, it's much easier to have the momentum for a punchline. And so, I give him, a certain amount of credit, but I also think that he's become formulaic in the second half of his career. And so one of the main points of my book, parroting Billy Collins, was to, go after those tics and those recurring things. There are a lot of poems that start in the kitchen and then go on to rather mundane aspects of his life, and then, really don't say much of anything at all. So that's there are a number of poems in the Billy Collins experience that, follow that pattern. But, at some point, in order to parody someone, if you don't have some affinity for the poet, right, and if the poet's not important, then sort of like, well, what's the point, right? So, it is, I suppose in some way, it's my bizarre form of literary criticism. And that's,
So would a broad, very unfair generalization be you sort of represent a very stuffy, nerdy class of poets versus his hat backwards, baggy jeans side of poets?
Yeah, I wouldn't fight that too much. Stuffy's a little harsh, maybe,
sure. Very broad, unfair, though.
Occasionally a little stiff, maybe,
sure.
Something
sure.
like that. Yeah. But yeah, no, that's not unfair.
Just as we've been going through this interview, if folks are not aware of you or your previous work, some of the things have been, who the heck is this guy? Reading, these, he's the only guy that's, checked out that book from the library. All of a very niche collection of works or translations, and like I said, languages that outnumber at least one hand. And they wouldn't be alone in wondering who A.M. Juster is. I went on a similar ride as I kind of tried to get to the bottom of it. And I found that in 2010, First Things put out an article.
I was outed.
Yes, so you were outed. A.M. Juster, which is a pseudonym, if folks haven't gotten that far yet. Yeah, June of 2010, it was an article called "Regard the Scuttlebutt is True." And I imagine that this wasn't necessarily a First Things foray into a TMZ sort of hit piece. I imagine you had a part of that, or at least the decision to let that go. Can you talk about your pseudonym and who the heck you are?
Sure. So there was an attempted hit piece before. So I had been fairly straight up with my regular editors. So Jody Bottom, who was editor of First Things in those days, was desperate to, have this piece written about me, and I had put him off for years. But then
Paul is his name Paul Mariani?
Yes, Paul Mariani, yes.
Okay.
So what happened was, when I was commissioner of the Social Security Administration, there was
which we're just going to fly by that for the rest of the story, but we'll come back to that.
Yeah. One of the three public employee unions is just always hates the administration. It was the same thing when I was working there in the 80s, the same people pretty much. And they have this guy that runs the biggest blog on Social Security who's always backing them up and always tearing apart, the senior leadership of the administration. So they found out somehow. They were looking desperately for dirt on me, and they couldn't find anything. And somehow in the course of digging for the dirt, they found out about the poetry. So they handed it to this guy who writes the blog, figuring he'd take me apart. And God bless him, he didn't really know what to do with it. And so he just sort of reported it in sort of a fairly offhand way. But at that point, Jody said, look, you're out without any context. You got to let me do this piece. And so I finally said, okay, let's do it. And it's been wonderful because I've gotten to know Paul Mariani too, just a wonderful scholar and poet, and has become a good friend. And he lives out in Western Massachusetts. And, about once a year, I drive out and have lunch with him. I'm not doing it this year because of COVID, but most years I go out to the Berkshires and have lunch with Paul.
So before we kind of get more into what you spent the majority of your life doing in terms of your vocation, which wasn't a poet,
right?
He had this quote from the article. Michael J. Astrew is the best poet ever to hold a truly major appointed position in the American government. And A.M. Juster is the best senior civil servant of whom American poetry can boast. So you were appointed at one point by President George W. Bush.
Yes.
To do what exactly? And by the way, what you should put that somewhere important. I don't know if it's a tombstone worthy quote, but it's a great quote.
It's a great quote. So the short version is I basically split my professional career in most of it in two places. I served in senior jobs in the federal government for about 15 years under 4 presidents, 3 Republican and 1 Democratic. And I was also in the biotech industry for 15 years, originally a general counsel at Biogen, which I think at the time was the second largest biotech company in the country. And then I worked at a company called TKT, left, was brought back as CEO to turn it around, and had one of the better and quickest turnarounds in the history of the industry. So I've kind of done the grand tour of healthcare, welfare, social service programs, disability from different angles. And so that's been most of my niche. It was healthcare and social security that brought me to work at HHS in the Reagan administration, second term. Originally I was a deputy assistant secretary for legislation, and then Margaret Heckler got pushed out, and I got moved out to Social Security and worked directly for the commissioner. And then I went into the White House, working at the end of the Reagan administration, and was briefly ethics officer, and then was held over for a little while into the Bush administration, and I did Iran-Contra cleanup for a little while, and a lot of nominations and legislative work, and wrote executive orders and things like that. And then came back. I was nominated to be General Counsel of Health and Human Services in '89, and did that job for 3.5 years, which also put me on the board that wrote the first regulations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Then I came back home, parked extremely briefly at a wonderful law firm, but then went across the river, and I worked at Biogen for 6 years. Went to a very small company to a large company selling a really important multiple sclerosis drug.
Oh, wow.
And then I went to this company that was trying to do too much. And what the main thing I did for them when I got there was make the painful decision to stop doing lots of technically interesting stuff and focus on what they were doing best and was most valuable, particularly in the short run, which was rare diseases, mostly for children.
Okay.
And we were really, in a lot of ways, this is kind of the second or third company in that zone. Genzyme really was the pioneer. But, we got some important drugs to market. I then lost a hostile takeover to a British company called Shire. Shire got taken out about a year ago, and Takeda, a Japanese company, bought them. And Takeda's actually been very nice to me. I got locked out of my company when we lost to Shire, but Takeda invited me back. I got a very extensive tour, got to meet with a lot of people. It was actually a nice closure event for me. So that's basically been my professional career. And, I started writing poetry again in the early 90s. And, it was something that I could do other than just work, but, still be at home and near the kids and, that kind of thing. And so, that's kind of what I did when I wasn't working. I don't have other hobbies. I don't watch a lot of TV. I don't do online gaming, and I don't do a lot of the things that take up a lot of people's time.
Yeah.
Basically, most of my life, I worked really hard in my professional life. I've had a fair number of civic activities and, nonprofits and charities and stuff too, and read and worked on poetry. I mean, that's really been my life. As
you look back, so you retired with sort of the workload you've given yourself with poetry now. Is there a part of you that wishes you could go back in the 90s and or even sooner and give it a go as you are now? Yeah, I mean, you always look back and say, I wish back then I knew what I know now. But, there's no easy way, to write formal poetry. I mean, there are people, I guess, that seem to have had the knack from a very early age. But, it takes a while. And I think the fact that I was away from it for a while means that I don't take it for granted. Sure. I think particularly, a lot of people that come out of MFA programs and that kind of becomes their job, I think it starts to drain the joy of it from. I actually feel sorry for them, a lot of the time. I was briefly on the board of Associated Writers and Writing Programs, so I was most of the board was professors at MFA programs. And, some of them were pretty happy, but, a lot of them really weren't. And I did have the feeling that turning their avocation into their vocation really didn't make them as happy as they thought it would when they made the decision to do that. So I think I've had a nice balance in my life. I think the fact that I've had an interesting professional life has enriched the poetry. I was going to say, if J.R.R. Tolkien once said, the leaf mold of his mind, as he pulled, so came all of the things he wrote. Where would your poetry be without, a tumultuous appointment by George W. Bush? We'll never know. I think that's really right. That the various forms of public service and the working in healthcare and spending a lot of time with seriously sick people. It makes you think about the world differently than if it's all an abstraction and you're sitting on a college campus and most of the time you're dealing with healthy, excited young people, and there's positives to that. I mean, I taught 1 year at Emerson College as an adjunct. Taught poetry, just really for fun, and I had fun with it, and I enjoyed doing it, and probably would like to do it again, someday. But there can be too much of a good thing too, and I think the fact that I've had an interesting balance in my life has made me a happier person, and I think ultimately it's made the poetry better because it's different from other people's. And right. They're different things that I think are important, worthwhile for people to think about, and I think. The sense I'm having with this book, Wonder and Wrath, people are picking up on that a lot more than before. They're starting to say, oh, yeah, okay, kind of seeing it now. So I'm excited about that. Shortly ago, a few months ago, I started following you on Twitter, and it is a very wholesome, as far as Twitter goes, it's a very wholesome place, your Twitter and sort of the lanes that you swim in. But one thing that I wanted to note and make sure I asked you about, as I was scrolling one day, I saw a tweet where you had quote tweeted a picture of Robert Frost's farm, and you said, "This is where I teach most summers for 3 days in June. It's an incredible kick to advise students in Robert Frost's kitchen, sitting in one of his rocking chairs beside his potbelly stove." I got to hear more about that. Tell me about that. Yeah. So there had been sort of one big blowout sort of Woodstock Formalist conference that started in 95 by Dana Gioia and Michael Pike. And then it got very troubled. It had to close down for a year. And then it reopened under sort of new management. It was never really the same. And so there have been several sort of attempts of generally smaller conferences to form. And it hasn't gone all that well.
But one of the ones that's done well, in part because it stayed very small and intimate, is the Frost Farm Conference in Derry, New Hampshire, which a very fine formal poet named Robert Crawford runs. And it's a National Park Service site. So the footprint is very small. A lot of the activities happen in a couple of tents that they rent. But they have readings at night in the barn, which has got wonderful acoustics. It's just the right size. And you just can kind of feel frost, looking down from the rafters. I mean, it's quite an experience. And then, for the one-on-one meetings, I kind of cut a deal with Bob that, I get the kitchen and, and, it really is kind of, his potbelly stove and his rocking chair. And, you just, you sit and wait for the next student to come in and you just kind of say to yourself, how wonderful is this,
The very coolest. That was awesome. I had a double take and didn't recover very quickly. So I'm very jealous.
And hopefully now they had to cancel this year for COVID, but fingers crossed, they'll be back, next June.
2021. So, here I come.
Yeah. They're about, it seems like they're about 14 frost farms. He did sort of wander around New England. But if you're checking this out, make sure you get the right frost farm, which is one in Derry, New Hampshire.
Okay.
And check it out on the web. It's a really nice, it's quite reasonably priced. And a really, if you're interested in formal poetry, it's a great way to spend 3 days.
And hang out with you in the kitchen next to the stove.
Yeah, that's right.
You've been awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time, especially during a hectic time. Do you mind, could I ask you to read a poem from Wonder and Wrath?
Sure. Why don't I do this one that ran in National Review? And this comes from a trip that my bride and I had been talking about taking for a very long time and then finally did. So we drove around the South, and we have a son and wonderful daughter-in-law in Northern Virginia. And we went down to Charlottesville and saw Monticello and then visited an old friend in Durham and then went down to Charleston. And we were driving through the back roads by choice in South Carolina. And that inspired this poem, which is called Behold. It's also, I'll just note from a technical point of view, there's a poet that you might not think I have a lot in common with named Carl Phillips, who's kind of the master of syntax.
Okay.
And one of the things I've stolen from him, he's a master of poems in one extended sentence to try to hold the reader's attention. And so it's a very interesting technique. I mean, I won't say he's the first to do it, but I didn't really pay attention to it until I started reading Carl Phillips. And so this poem is all in one sentence. Behold, let the state highway cleave cold stubble fields so that both empty lanes extend like grace. And let prim churches in the ratio of 7 Baptists to each Methodist appear with rigid regularity close to the road, their dead even closer, with small, flat, rusting markers on most graves. Then drive another 20 minutes more to see the trees defer to furrowed soil, except for this one rise, where pines aspire to reach, where crows and turkey vultures rule. And let those who have nursed the dirt behold the blush and burgundies of morning clouds that do not stifle early rays of sun from blanketing the hillside's eastern slope, where mothers, fathers, aunts, and uncles wait and gravestones chalice that unearthly light.
I love it. Thank you so much, sir.
No, happy to do it. Really appreciate your time and attention.
Of course. Everybody go get Wonder and Wrath. It's from Paul Dry Books. I'm sure it's available everywhere, including Amazon.
And if you want the inside scoop on, things like the Frost Farm Conference, I'm over tweeting at AM Juster.
Perfect.
So at AM Juster on
Juster.
Twitter. Yeah.
I think I was saying Juster. Now I've ruined the whole thing.
It doesn't really matter to me. It's a pseudonym anyway. I can't get my back up about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'd love to have you back on as soon as possible.
Yeah, anytime, give a go. You know where to find me now.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Take care.